Good morning. This looks fun. I'm going to try to talk about art and biology, and also about the aesthetics behind the engineering of life, or the redesigning of life, or the playing with life. It's me collecting horseshit in Helsinki for a DNA isolation lab I did a couple of months ago. It's a great source of DNA. The first thing I want to talk about is control and drift. There's something called continental drift, and there's something called genetic drift. And I want you to imagine that our faces right now, compared to 1,000 years from now, the eyes and nostrils and mouth and ear placement could be considered right now to be Pangea, because they are slowly drifting into different formations. There's a continental drift of our bodies. That's how we got here from worms. We got to elbows through drift. And so when we try to engineer life, the idea is that it will conform to our controlled expectations. And actually, in particular, when it comes to synthetic biology, I've talked to people that are working with synthetic biology. Right now they're working mostly with bacteria, but when they move on up to worms and flies, the idea is that if those projects don't conform to the controlled expectation, they kill them and go back to the original sample, because these organisms are just factories for even iGEM performances. But I want you to remember that control has drift built into it, so we're not actually in control. Nonetheless, I kind of like the idea of, if we're going to make new bodies, that we would have the widest range possible. And this is an aesthetic range, which doesn't mean the widest range of beauty, or the widest range of idealism, or the widest range of joy, but actually all the different feelings that are possible for a human should be expressed in the future anatomy of organisms. And this includes all sorts of feelings, not just the quizzical either, but also exhaustion, anger, angst. I guess there's been a lot of talk about provocative feelings. It's hard in a conference like this, a seminar like this, to help you focus on the provocative feelings that you might be able to achieve. Right? Because we're just heads in here. But I hope that we get to the canyons and the swamps of our feelings through not just interaction, but actually through the germline, through the hereditary cascade that we're reforming. We should be able to elicit all sorts of feeling. Right now we have a very few aesthetics being applied at the level of the genome, right? I'm going to go through a couple of them, and this is how I perceive it, okay? We had some talk with the patent office about utility. Utility is the measure of aesthetics worth funding right now. Applied, utilitarian, engineered organisms are, to me, sort of pop art, okay? And that's because Andy Warhol was talking about product orientation and advertising, but he had a cynicism built in, and I think it's built into the aesthetics of use value at this point in our history. In other words, it may be applied or utilitarian or engineered, but we know that these are life forms and that they have beingness of some sort or another. And if they're just being considered to be industrial processing plants, the cynicism is implied. But actually, it's still accepted. In fact, it's heavily funded because it's useful for perpetuation of what you could look at the last presentation and we'll see, but I'm not sure. Another aesthetic that's worth funding, another aesthetic that is popular, is, I should talk about this a little bit. I guess I was. Implicit in this applied utilitarian engineer, the cynicism implicit in it is this dichotomy between pain, right? And as we go up the scale from bacteria to worm to fly to vertebrates to cuteness to humans, pain becomes a more important factor in the economy of use. This is actually a pamphlet from a class that I taught with Kathy High at Rensselaer Polytechnic, where I'm doing my PhD. And this was about actually not just animal enrichment, but we actually included all life enrichment. So the potential for enriching the lives of worms, the potential for enriching the lives of bacteria even. And there are all these different things to look at. Is there a look at thing here? Oh, look at all those things. Stress reduction. There's actually, a lot of this is used in zoos, and what we have to do is assess the psychological needs of even those with small brains, so that they exhibit appropriate behavior for tourists at zoos and don't show signs of being completely insane through confinement. I would say I'm going into a potentially a very dangerous residency in Switzerland over the summer near a refugee camp, working with, not a refugee, what's it called? Detainment camp for refugees, right? A jail for families. They're released during the day from 9 to 12, and from 1 to 5 they can walk in the park. And I'm thinking about engaging them in a non-human enrichment project, but it's very, very political because they're sort of in a human zoo. We know where that comes from. Okay, so another aesthetic that's heavily funded, we talked about a little bit, right, is health. And the line between health and enhancement is very blurry. I have a problem with Humanity Plus people, and it's on the level of idealism, which was talked about to some extent, and what I call naive perfectionism, and eventually world rejection, which is to say that on the way to idealism, we want to upload our consciousness and get rid of our meat bodies because they're falling apart, or make our meat bodies immortal. But the focus is on giant frontal lobes, bigger, longer, more powerful legs, super humanity. And eventually, I think it's, for one thing, it's a pre-modern ideology of aesthetics. For another thing, I guess people talk about quality of life. I talk about diversity of life, like divergence of experience. And this idea of longevity being the most important thing, immortality itself, smacks to me of, well, why don't we just become a perfect sphere without any orifices? We'll get rid of the eyes and the ears and the mouth and shitting and excrement. Actually, we'll get rid of external stimuli. We could just be a contained glass sphere, right? That would be ideal. So, I mean, to me, this is sort of one aesthetic. I don't know how much it's worth funding. It's true a lot of scientists are helping in some ways with health, and also industry, the same industry that helps with health, causes a lot of the health problems. That's how they can sell time on their MRIs with all those tumors. So it's kind of a confusing economy. Along with this, and this coincides with the last lecture, we have to remember that in the cycle of life, when we're reusing and recycling, we also have to remember to rewild. And this goes against some of the extras that come with the health regime. So I'm not sure how that plays in. You guys have to figure it out yourself. You're sitting in this room right now. One that's confusing for me is fundamental or pure R&D, which I think that a lot of scientists are practicing, and they say, I'm doing AIDS research, or cancer research, or Hodgkin's disease research, but actually they're sort of like, when I say 32, and I can ask any one of you, and you'll say 32. And where the hell was that in your head? Where is it? I want to find the 32. But to get funding, they don't say, I practice jazz in the lab. I'm an improvisator, I like to just pick up my scientific saxophone and see what comes out of it. You're not really allowed to say that except during wartime. Because then they're like, what have you got? And they're like, give me some money. I'll tell you what I got later. This is play and surprise, and actually sometimes, to be idealist, artists are doing the same thing as scientists there, and we can talk. That is kind of, it's not my forte to be idealist. it's a possibility that artists and scientists are fundamentally pure in just that very little sense. Along with this, though, I mean, artists do have things to offer like this. This is a very, just one slide from my sociobiology of net porn. But I'll only show you this one slide or maybe one more. I have a general theory of extremes, and this is one that, you know, I mean, obviously we're talking about some deep psychological problems of the human race. I don't know if climate change is totally anthropogenic, but I do know that the language is totally anthropocentric. But we have drives, and our drives drive our drives, so there's that. We have a dynamic orificial equilibrium, which means if you see too much, you either need to cry or blow your nose or shit more or talk more. And if you eat too much, you might need to have more sex or your hair grows more. In other words, either you become hugely obese or way too skinny, or if you have an equilibrium, it's between the holes in your body, the ins and outs, the flow itself. And this metabolism, both on a human-centric scale and on a planetary scale, is actually something that is driven by drives without actually, how do we say, we haven't achieved total reduction yet, right? We haven't materialized the entire world and reduced it to a formula. So when we look at the metabolism of geoengineering, we maybe have to think a little bit pornographically and a little less like bio-bricking, right? That will jam up our dynamic orificial equilibrium. I'll let you figure out what it means that sexual diversity is a reproductive fitness test, but I would say that anything and everything that people are doing is really good for survival. Another well-funded aesthetic, defense, weaponry, right? DARPA, defense advanced research projects in the US funds a lot of artistic seeming projects. I would say that this is a kind of tap dance, right? It's a funny tap dance. It's sort of, how do I say, it's that cabaret tap dance on human skulls, right? Where you sort of have a top hat and a cane and you dance on the skulls and you kick them about, gore cabaret. But nonetheless, plenty, maybe 1/3 of our research money is coming for this type of cabaret. So these are the aesthetics, and I refer to all science as being a subset of art. And don't worry, I do think that science is performance art, and I do think that it's mostly like a minimalist conceptual field. And if you like look at conceptual minimalist art and look at scientific papers, they almost completely coincide. But I also think that art is a subset of pornography. So no offense to science, you're just a subset of art, which is a subset of a kind of porn, of exhibitionism. But this one is heavily funded, much less so than some of them that I'm going to show you. For instance, this is not funded at all. The Rococo Biolistic Transgenic Arts has no funding at this point. I would like to accept, you know, money. I'm actually probably going to get one of these Biorad gene guns. These are biolistic guns that shoot nano gold dust coated in active genes. And you can shoot it anywhere. You can shoot it into someone's ovaries, right? You just sort of like open it up and bam! And then you collect their eggs later, and if you have the Rococo genes in there, then those eggs are ready to go, make some sculpture, right? It's not funded yet, but it's just another aesthetic worthy of our, you know, EU, whatever, global funding. Another thing we could do is just take all the money from the market and break it into 100,000 euro chunks and give anyone, woman or man, 100,000 euros for voluntary sterilization, right? And this would get rid of the market and the population problem all at once. Hey. Then there's synchromism, electroporation, germline arts. I should explain this a little bit. What I'm doing is comparing art movements I have almost no idea about. This is synchromism here on these cat testicles. And this is an electroporator, the cutest one on the market. I'm comparing like really cute transfection devices, right? Gene guns are real. This is an electroporator, so a gene gun shoots genes with nanodust into cell nuclei. Electroporation, a much more feminine thing, it sucks up the cells in here and then shocks them, kind of like Frankenstein. And it shocks their, not just their pores, their orifices of the outside of the cells, but also the nuclear membrane opens up. And the genes are allowed to flow into the center, supposedly the center of the gene's organizational facility. Because we squished cells on a plate of glass and looked and saw a yolk in the middle, we assume that whatever is in there must be the center, just like our corporations. Actually, people are finding out that the Golgi apparatus is basically a bunch of chilled out sofas for proteins to mingle. And after they get transcribed, they just hang out in the Golgi going, what do you want to do today? I don't know, let's mingle. And they just shake. And this central repository it's because we eat fried eggs and we see the yellow center, the nucleus. It's important. Okay, synchromism, electroporation arts are yet to be funded. Okay, just another aesthetic. How about stem cell microinjection DNA op art? Okay, so we'll take mouse embryonic stem cells, tissue cultured on a fibroblast monolayer, and target a gene that expresses this op art pattern. And then we'll take those stem cells and inject them into these embryos. These are mouse embryos. I love to go to labs and say, what are you doing? It's actually, it's something that I do. So I went to the Genomics Institute in Albany, New York, part of Wadsworth, and talked to Carrie Klutzman. I talked too much and she won't answer my calls now. It's too bad, she looked like someone from Blade Runner. It was hot. Carrie, if you're out there. So these are 2-cell mouse embryos. And if you put a stem cell that's engineered in there at that very point with a microinjector, a little needle, the core of which is about the size of a nuclear membrane. Here's a picture. Yeah, actually, our next grant is about biosolar cells. I'm working with Rob and some other people at Leiden and the VOG Society in Amsterdam, and we actually went to this country called Belgium. I guess right down the street near Antwerp, to the Verbatim Foundation, and we gave people the chance to do hands-on microinjection of zebrafish embryos with chloroplasts, hoping to make solar zebrafish that wouldn't need to eat. Anyway, what we found was people, although presented with the bioethical dilemma, unlike a Milgram experiment, people told again and again, this is probably ethically suspect. We found that people will still microinject when given a chance, so the problem is deeper than we think. But this will make these kinds of pigs, or mice. These are mice, sorry. Okay. I've been told to speed up, so we won't really cover constructed painting, lipid transfer, genetic arts, maybe next time, okay? But I am trying to get William S. Burroughs' shit into a dish full of blood, shit, and sperm, probably to promote AIDS research, because as we know, blood, shit, and sperm mixed together is, right. Third millennium eugenic husbandry bioarts. You can go see the show. Obviously, this is development as an art, and this is one of the problems with art as life and life as art is this crossover is visceral and yucky, and there's a yuck factor. But what I'm trying to say is when people are making mutated embryos, that they're actually nature in drag, or nature as transvestite, right? Scientists are putting on the clothing of nature. They're not really inventing anything that's not happening. They're actually trying to gain control over what's already happening And by wearing the clothes of nature, they think they might be able to fuck the machine. And that's okay, because as we saw before, any kind of sexual expression is a sign of being a part of a reproductive fitness test. And a lot of these aesthetics are getting well funded and do help you get a mate, even if your mate is a machine. Right? So I guess I'm looking eventually for the inherited case against art, living anti-art, engineered arts. I'm not sure if I'll find it, but to wrap up, I have a 3-point plan. One, I mean, this is sort of what I think we should do. We should lean on, I've also learned that I should explain what I'm talking about when I write stuff like this, because it's otherwise just really obviously fascist dictator stuff. I don't actually believe in genetic determinism as being like more than 50% of our personality, our culture, our society. But I do think that on the way towards engineering ourselves, we should definitely sell the public on the idea that they're completely determined by their genes. For people that believe in deconstructive thought, if we're genetically predetermined to redesign ourselves and we want to be sustainable, then we should redesign ourselves according to deconstructive aesthetics, because that will save the planet. I hope I explained that. Point 2, we should accentuate the role of advisory committees towards rewarding sociopathy. Sociopathy is designated as a psychological disease, but actually what it means is you don't have a conscience, a social conscience. So it's not it's a sociological disease. It's not a problem of the psyche, it's a problem of caring about others. And actually, when I say that the advisory committees, I'm talking about the bioethical advisory committees, the social implications, the people determining whether or not it's use value enough to, or benefit enough for the risk. These people actually just say, are you in science? Is your grant boring and illegible to the general public? We say, okay. This is the job of these advisory commissions, is to say okay to almost anything. I mean, it's actually scientific freedom that they're okaying, but what they're doing is keeping scientists from getting lawsuits. From the public response is, oh, you screwed up our entire food chain. Oh, well, we did a study and it said we might have done that, but that the risk was low. So we checked it out, and so we're off the hook. I don't see this as advice for the future. I see this as actually what's going on right now already. But maybe we could open up. I mean, that's almost all I want to do is open up and say, why don't you just get sociopathic on this shit and be like, all right, let's try everything. Who gives a shit? And still get funding. Last point. If we're going to funnel funding towards simple aesthetics like assumed utilitarianism, pure research, health and ecology, or moving towards sustainability through GMOs, why don't we just let it go and say, in the name of design, let's pursue all aesthetics possible. In the name of mutation, let's get perverted and let's make it contagious. Why not go airborne, like ear pox, right? So that people would sneeze on you and you'd grow ears everywhere. It's a surrealist dream come true. We're sort of already here, but I'm just trying to underscore that we might open up. This is my tribute to Americans. It's my version of American Gothic. That guy who left the room already was not too far off. So.